In 1788, a group of boys were playing behind New York Hospital when they heard some sort of commotion coming from the second-story window. When they found out what was happening inside of that room, it would spark a riot that lasted for 3 days in New York City. This story has some disturbing subject matter, and because of that, of course, your discretion is advised. But before we get into that, if you're a fan of learning about New York City's wild stories through a storytelling format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all I do. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a like and a comment. Do not comment in my Instagram DMs. That's not doing anybody any favors. Alright, you ready? I'm ready. Let's get into today's story. The year is 1788. 34 years earlier, or 1754, New York got its first college, which was King's College. It was located right next to Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan. After the American Revolutionary War, King's College wanted to distance itself from its British roots, so it would be renamed Columbia College. However, by 1788, it is still the only college in town. In 1788, you might go to college to study a number of different things. Maybe you wanted to study law or theology. Perhaps you wanted to nerd out like me and study mathematics. Or another big one was medicine. However, in 1788, you did not need a college degree in order to become a doctor. You just needed to learn the right information. So if you couldn't afford to go to Columbia College, or maybe you couldn't get into Columbia College, there was a number of people who were offering classes elsewhere, so you might look for some sort of private classes. Now, at this time, there's only one shelter for the ill in New York City, and that would be New York Hospital. It sat atop a hill just west of Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Now, during the American Revolutionary War, the British occupied New York Hospital, but when the war was over, they left it in a very poor condition. So by 1788, New York Hospital is still not functioning as an active hospital. A few physicians from Columbia College and elsewhere decided they wanted to make a little bit more money. So what they did was they went to New York Hospital and converted 2 of their hospital rooms into laboratories. That way students could come and take classes there and learn medicine. On a morning in mid-April, a group of boys would go behind New York Hospital and play in the grassy lot that was there behind the building. Then they heard some sort of commotion coming from the second floor. They didn't know what these noises were, but they were startling enough where each of the boys took notice. And when they looked up to the second-story window, they saw that there was something dangling outside of the window. Although they couldn't really tell what it was, it just looked like a giant sausage. Now, one of the boys happened to spot a ladder that was sitting in the grass. So he asked the boys to come on over and help me prop up the ladder and we can get a closer look at what this thing is. So that's what they did. They propped the ladder up against the wall and start climbing rung by rung. And when they started to get a little bit closer, they realized it was not a giant sausage. It was a human arm. As it turned out, those 2 hospital rooms that were converted into laboratories were not for mixing chemicals or for listening to lectures. They were dissection labs. Human corpses were needed for this kind of work. However, they were very difficult to provide. In fact, they were often unavailable to prestigious colleges. They were very expensive. Now, these classes were being held by Dr. Richard Bailey, a Connecticut-born doctor who had actually studied in England, where body snatching was a lot more common. Now, there's a number of different burial grounds in the city already, despite the fact the city's not particularly large yet. If you were a wealthier white person, odds are you were probably buried over at Trinity Church in their cemetery. If you were not wealthy, odds are you were buried in the Potter's Field just north of the city, which would have been just above where present-day City Hall is located. In fact, just off to the side of that was a separate burial ground for freed blacks and slaves, as slavery had not been abolished in New York until 1827. All of these different burial grounds had all seen corpses stolen from their properties as early as February, but because rumors often distorted facts in this era, a lot of people had a lot of difficulty pinpointing what was accurate information and what wasn't. Then these boys went to go play behind the hospital, and everything changed. Now, because this was just a group of boys who first saw what happened, it's difficult to say for sure what actually happened, but one of the most common accounts is that when these group of boys climbed that ladder to get a good look at what this dangling thing was hanging out of the window, one of the students inside the hospital actually saw them and took the arm and waved it at them and insinuated that the arm belonged to one of their mothers. And because one of these boys' mothers had just recently died, it terrified him, and he immediately abandoned the rest of the boys and ran straight home to tell his dad. When the boy gets home, he's all frantic, and the father, he doesn't know what's going on. He's trying to get his son to calm down, but the boy would simply exclaim, "They have mom, they have mom." And the father is standing there wondering, what the heck is he talking about? His mom is dead. My wife is dead. She's buried in the ground. But then the boy explained to his father what he saw in the New York hospital window, and his dad immediately started to remember all of these rumors that he had heard spreading through the city about grave robbery. So the boy's father assembled a team, grabbed a shovel, and went straight out to the burial site to make sure that his wife was still in her coffin. When they finally reach the grave site, they immediately start digging. And when they start digging, every single time that this man drives his shovel into the soil and removes some, he has his fingers crossed, he is praying, "I hope that my wife is still in that box." When they finally reached the casket, they ripped it open, and it was empty. This man is now infuriated. He gets all of these angry worker friends of his that have joined him for this dig to join him now in a march to New York Hospital. And they would tell everyone along the way that they passed, "Hey, they took my wife, yours could be next." And as they got closer and closer to the hospital, more and more people started to join in on this march. Now, some of these doctors and students may have discussed what to do in the event that people actually showed up to the hospital, but when one of them actually looked out the window and saw a mob of people starting to approach the hospital, some of these doctors and students immediately fled the scene. However, there were a few people who wanted to stay behind and protect their work. After all, in their own mind, they had worked to dig up these bodies, they had performed whatever experiments on them, but it was no use. The anatomy room contained 3 fresh bodies. One was described as boiling in a kettle, while the other 2, one male and one female, had already been cut up, and parts of them were dangling in a most brutal position. When these enraged workers finally got inside, they ransacked this place. I mean, they tore it apart. Any beakers were smashed, flasks were thrown out the window, glass was broken everywhere, and of course, all of these specimens that were all around this lab were taken for reburial. Now, despite how quickly everything evolved at the hospital, the mob was loud enough with their intentions that people knew what was happening. So the mayor and the sheriff were both able to intervene before there was any bloodshed at the hospital. In fact, the mayor and the sheriff would escort the doctors and the students to jail in order to protect them. After the specimens of human flesh were returned to the cemeteries, the mob dispersed, and the city officials assumed that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The following morning, another mob formed outside of the New York hospital, and their voices carried, and more people started to join in the pandemonium. And then one man decided to shout out to everyone, "You know what? That's impossible. There's no way that those were the only bodies inside of the hospital. There has to be more somewhere. So somebody shouted, "Let's check the hospital again." And then another person joined in and said, "You know what? A lot of these students were probably from Columbia College. Let's check the college." And then another person said, "You know what? A lot of these doctors have homes. I wouldn't be shocked if they're keeping bodies in their personal dwellings." So all of these people and all of these places fell under suspicion. So the mob fanned out. They went to each and every one of these locations. They started over at the hospital and went room by room and left it in a very poor condition. Then they went to Columbia College and searched room by room, student by student, lab by lab. They went to every single doctor's private home that they could find. There wasn't a single doctor in town that felt safe, and it got out of hand very quickly. For example, an innocent man was beaten in the streets simply for wearing all black because that was common apparel for the profession at the time. There was even an instance where the people in the streets were passing the residence of Sir John Temple, the British Consul General. However, when they were passing by his home, someone thought they heard Surgeon Temple instead of Sir John Temple, and his home would be broken into as well. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the militia was sent out to disperse the crowds. However, they were sent out in small enough groups where the mob was able to easily outnumber them and disarm them and break their weapons. And once the militiamen were disarmed, they immediately ran for cover. The crowds converged on the prison where the doctors and students were being held and demanded, "Bring out your doctors." They were threatening to kill every single doctor in town if that's what it took to make things right and put an end to all of this. The mayor tried to talk these people down. Alexander Hamilton tried to talk these people down. However, they may as well have been debating with a hurricane. You also had people like John Jay, a founding father who was harmed in the doctors' riot. You had the governor who accidentally harmed himself with his own sword in these attacks. Nothing was working. When the chaos continued into a third day, regular soldiers were ordered to march at the rioters. Now, the mayor was very reluctant to give a fire order because he felt compelled to protect the people that he was governing. But as more bricks and more stones were thrown through the windows, it became very clear that this was very unsafe. So, the mayor finally gave the order. The muskets fired, and bodies immediately started to fall. As soon as the mob heard gunfire, they all started to run for it. And after 3 days of rioting, this mob had finally dispersed. For whatever reason, the doctors' riot does not have an official body count. But what we can tell you is it was at least 6 people who died, and by the end of it, it may have been as many as 20 people. In 1789, the first American law to regulate anatomy practice was officially passed by state legislature. Doctors would be allowed to experiment on the bodies of executed murderers, prisoners, arsonists, and burglars. However, respectable citizens were to be left alone. As for the imprisoned doctors and students, they would eventually be released into the countryside for their own protection. And then in 1791, New York Hospital officially reopened. However, it would take years and years and years before people would finally trust it again. So that's going to do it. Remember, if you liked today's video, please make sure to like the video and leave a comment. Even if you're going to write something silly like, I would donate my body for science, or I am an organ donor. Here's my blood type. I don't know. Write something. Also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please make sure to do that. And remember, I am Mike, the NYC Storyteller. Thanks for joining me. Until next time. And awesome. I finally ended a video the right way. Thank God. It's still recording, isn't it?